Today is going to be 70-3. We're going to continue to describe a rational function, and we're going to examine the end behavior of a rational function. And so today's objective is we're going to describe the end behavior of a rational function. Now, if we go back to our previous graph, this has been the common graph we've been using for our past two lessons. We talked about this idea of vertical asymptotes and horizontal asymptotes. Now what we're going to do is we're going to kind of take those two concepts and we're going to put them together in describing the end behavior. Now remember, end behavior in previous lessons when we examined polynomials, we are describing the ends of the graph. Like what happens if I go this way to infinity, this way to infinity, this way to infinity, this way to infinity? What's going on there? And so remember, we're describing what our f of x is doing as our x is approaching from a certain number. Now the first type of end behavior that we can look at is what happens with our y as x is going to negative infinity and x is going to positive infinity. Now just remember, it's like we're leveling off. And always when x is going to negative infinity and positive infinity, it's going to approach those leveling off values, which are our horizontal asymptotes. So I can say when my x goes to negative infinity, my y, or my f of x, is going to approach 2, right? Because my horizontal asymptote here is going to be that positive 2. As x goes to positive infinity and goes on forever, it's going to approach that value of 2 again. Now taking a look at the vertical asymptotes, if we notice, this is kind of strange, because with that vertical asymptote of -1, it seems that it's both going to positive infinity and negative infinity. And so what we actually have to do is we have to dictate which side x is coming from. And so we're going to say a value to the negative means that x is approaching from the negative. If we have a value from the positive, it means that x is approaching from the positive value. So, for example, I can say x is approaching -1 from the negative side. And so that means that we're looking at it through this lens here, where this is going this way, and this means from the negative. And so if we're examining this from the negative side, if we're approaching that value of -1, it's going up, 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 and forever. And so I'm going to say that my y is going to go to positive infinity. Whereas the other one, now we can look at it from the positive. And so examining this from the positive, so we're coming from the positive direction, and it's going down forever. So I'm going to say as x approaches -1 from the positive, my y is going to go down forever to negative infinity. So graphing this function using a graphing utility, because remember, I haven't taught you how to graph rational functions yet, and so we're going to have to use a graphing utility to help us. So plot this equation into your graphing calculator, or Desmos, and you're going to get a graph that looks like this. And so now we need to describe the end behavior. Well, what is my x doing? Well, x is going to negative infinity. So I can say that. Now it helps us to label our horizontal and vertical asymptotes. So x is going to negative infinity. Now x is approaching this vertical asymptote to -2. It's approaching it from the negative direction, and it's approaching it from the positive direction. And then also, my x is now going to go on forever this way, so I can say x is going to positive infinity. So now let's describe what my y is doing. So as x is going to that negative infinity, x is approaching this number here or y is approaching this number of 1. When x is approaching -2 from the negative, so it's approaching it from the negative, it's going down forever, so y is going to negative infinity. When it's approaching -2 from the positive, it's going up forever, and so that's f of x is going to positive infinity. And then as x goes to positive infinity, it's once again approaching that horizontal asymptote of 1. And so this right here would be my end behavior. Looking at this next one, remember, enter this into your calculator and graph it. So drawing in your vertical and horizontal asymptotes absolutely helps. And so describing, let's see what my x is doing. Well, my x is going to negative infinity. My x is approaching this value of -1 from both the negative and the positive. it's approaching this value of 3 from both the negative and the positive. And then it's also going on forever, so x is going to infinity. So now we can describe what my y is doing. And so as x is going to negative infinity, it's approaching that value of 1. As x is approaching negative 1, it's going to go down forever, so y is going to negative infinity. From the positive, as x is approaching that negative 1, it's going up forever. From the negative, as x is approaching 3, from the negative, it's going down. It's going up. And then as it's going to infinity, it's approaching that value of 1. Let's look at one more. Now you may need to factor this to kind of help you determine what the asymptotes are, because remember that's going to factor into x plus 2 times x. So my vertical asymptotes are going to be 0 and negative 2. So now describing what my x is doing, well, x is going to negative infinity. X is going to this negative 2 from both the negative and the positive direction. And then it's also going to this 0 from the negative and positive direction. And then x is going to positive infinity. So now describing what my y is doing from there. When my x is going to negative infinity, my y is again going to 1. As it is approaching that negative 2, it's going to negative infinity. As it's approaching negative 2 from the positive, it's going to positive infinity. As it's approaching 0 from the negative, right? This is from the negative side, it's going down forever, so it's negative infinity. 0 from the positive, it's going up forever. And then as it's going on forever here, f of x is going to 1. So this is our basic intro to in behavior. If you guys do have any other questions, please leave them in the comments.